We explained that there are two souls, there are two drives, there are two willpowers, if you will, of a person. Let's move this over a little bit. There we go. There are two willpowers of a person. Because what is a soul? A soul is a drive. What is a drive? A drive is your innermost will, the thing you want most. So what does the godly soul want most? It wants godly things, selfless things. What does the animal soul want most? It wants animalistic things, selfish things, right? Survival, as you call it. So what we're going to explain, and this is really critical for the next 8 chapters, so for the next, I guess, few weeks, we'll explain on both sides what the soul is, how the soul works. This week we'll talk about the godly soul. But really, the souls are identical in their anatomy. So this class is labeled the anatomy of the soul, since we're going to explain how a soul works. What is a soul comprised of? Yes, a soul is energy, but what does that mean? Yes, a soul gives you inspiration, but what does that mean? A soul guides your thinking, in a sense, but what does that mean? So really, a soul is a drive. This week, we're going to talk about the anatomy of the soul, and then slide into the godly soul. And then in chapter 6, I believe we'll get more into the ego and how the ego works, at least from a spiritual standpoint. So it's on page 55, chapter 3. So essentially we have 10 powers of the soul. Getting right into it, there are 10 abilities that we have as people. We have 3 logical powers, the intellectual powers, the intellectual abilities, often called mothers. The reason why they're called mothers is because they parent. They're essentially parenting aspects of our cognition, of our psyche. And then you have emotional, which are usually called the doubles or called the children. And this brings in a Kabbalistic idea, which is a practical idea now in modern day psychology. Now it's already something which is taken for granted. But 250 years ago, this idea was a very new idea that logic dictates emotion. Logic leads emotion. The sign of immaturity, the sign of childhood, is that a person does something because I felt like it, right? It's what most children answer. Why? Because I felt like it. Whereas intellect has a reason. It may not be the reason why you did it, which Tanya gets into later about there's hidden reasons and obvious reasons, less obvious reasons, reasons you'll admit, reasons you won't admit, but there's a reason nonetheless. Whereas with emotions, there doesn't have to be a reason. The reason is the emotion itself. What's higher than emotion is logic. And in logic, we explain that there are 3 brains, if you will. 3 ways that we think. The first way, and this is going to be very simple in terms of just how the Tanya categorizes them. The first way is the initial thought, what we call inspiration, creativity. Inquiry is how he translates it here. Inquiry means you're asking a question. What? Chochma, you ever heard of Chacham? Chacham means a wise guy, right? Chochma means wise. What's wisdom? Wisdom is somebody who spits out knowledge. They say a quote, some quotable quote they heard from the internet, and it's good, right? The one-liner. You don't have time to inspire people with many lines, many paragraphs. One line, get them in a second. That line, although powerful, often makes no sense. By the way, it usually, right? It has no beef. It has no meaning. So, but at the same time, we offer that one line, and it's meant to get someone thinking. If a line makes you say, yeah, okay, that makes sense, or if a line changes your life, that's not really very common. It's not common at all. Usually a line is just a line, and it's meant to lead to something else. So the question, what they often call in creativity sessions, the spade question that gets you to ask deeper and deeper questions, is really what the Chochma is trying to get you to. So Chochma comes from 2 Hebrew words, which is koach, ma. Koach means the ability, the power, the potential. Ma of what? So when you ask what, ask why, that's the most powerful creative experience you could have. But it's only a creative experience, which will lead to an inspiration. The inspiration usually is just that. It's just an inspiration. It will come and it will leave as fast as it came, right? You get inspired, oh wow, that's awesome. You go to a play, go to a skit, go to a show, hear some nice quote, read a book, that's awesome. I really should think about this again, and then that's it, it's over. You then have a second brain, which could take over in the sense that you wanted to. If you focus for more than a second, if you focus for more than, or 8 seconds, I think the attention span today is in the modern age. If you focus for more than 8 seconds, you begin to get another level, which is called cognition. Cognition, comprehension, understanding, lesson understanding is really just analysis. What is this idea? What does it represent? What is it trying to convey? Right? And often if you read a quotable quote, you'll have questions on the quotable quote. There's 16 situations where that quotable quote doesn't apply. Or how do you achieve that quotable quote? Or, what does the person who said, what was he experiencing that he came to that quotable quote in the first place? So through time, through energy, through investigation, right, you will come to a greater understanding, a deeper understanding. And by the way, it's interesting that the modern day example of this is meditation. Not hoo-ha meditation where a person just sits and thinks about nothing for 4 hours. But when a person thinks about something, Jewish meditation, unlike Buddhist meditation, means focusing on an idea. If you could think about something, someone once said to me, he said, imagine you're looking at a hat. He says, focus on the hat and meditate on the hat. Don't think about anything else other than the hat. So in this situation, think about the cup, right? Just the cup. Think about the color of the cup, thinking about the texture, the width, the dimensions of it, but never ever go beyond that cup. How long could a person think about that cup for? A minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. Usually after a few seconds, your mind begins to wander. Bring your mind back. Some say that the whole purpose of meditation is to bring your mind back. In Jewish meditation, the purpose of the meditation is to get to a point, to get to a realization that you wouldn't have had before thinking about this thing. So if you ever realize something through thinking about it, hey, I just realized something, that usually is because you're thinking about it. Now, you may have been thinking about it sporadically over the course of many hours, or you may have been thinking about it sort of like in a subconscious way, but nevertheless thinking about it, and therefore you come to a realization. That's called Binah. Binah, from the word mevin. Mevin, in Hebrew and English, actually, same word, means understanding. A maven is a master of something. He figures it out, right? She knows it. It's something which is knowledgeable, intelligible. So you have an idea, and now you're able to even express the idea. And that's why Binah, which is comprehension, is generally connected to speech. Because when you have the idea, you're not able to share the pure creative experience. For like the same way you can't share a dream. Why can't you share a dream often? Because as soon as you start thinking about a dream is not a thoughtful process. It's just thoughts that are coming to you, sort of like inspirations. But you didn't do anything to think about them. So when you start to think about them, your mind is completely switching tracks and it's very hard to go back to its original point. Whereas if a person has a thought process, if you ever get lost, you could always go back. If you're ever thinking about something and then you lost your train of thought, what do? You go back to what you were thinking. Because the same way you got to it the first way, the same way your mind went from point A to point B to point C to point D, you could do it a second time and a third time. So usually if you go back, you follow your train of thought from the first thought, you'll come to the same realization that you came the first time around. Occasionally you'll forget it, and then a few hours later, now I remember what I was going to say. That's called Binah. You have a third intellect, a third brain, probably the most important brain. This is the one we're going to talk about tonight, is called Daas. Daas is interesting because usually people don't talk about Daas. Daas means understanding, to really get it, to understand it, to internalize it. The problem with Daas is that it's so seldom focused on. And as we mentioned, Daas means to focus. So if you're able to meditate on something for 5, 6, 7 hours, which in today's modern world seems almost impossible. How could you do anything for 7 hours? But if you could, you can come to not only a realization or a deeper understanding of what it originally was, but it becomes part of you. So for instance, back to the original quotable quote, you take a quote, you start thinking about it, you take a few hours. At the end of the few hours, you come to a practical realization that could change your life in a way. So it's a life-changing thought. It's no longer just a fleeting thought, a fleeting idea, but it's an internalized one. It's an actual one. And this gives birth to emotion. So we have the first 3 levels of the soul mapped out. First is the inspiration, the initial inquiry of an idea, asking why, asking what, getting a good question, or having a starting point at least. The second is cognition. understanding, analysis, meditation, thinking, understanding. Then finally you have Das, which is internalization, or some call recognition or recognition, where a person is able to come back to an idea and recognize it as his own, right? So cognition, recognition is in a sense thinking about something and then realizing that you thought about something. When you see something, it's familiar to you, it's because you've thought about it so much that it's become part of your life. By the way, these three brains, if you take the first letter of each one, Chochma, Ches, Binah, Bet, and Daled, and Daat, Daled, you get Chabad. And that is why primarily, So this is primarily why the Tanya became synonymous with Chabad philosophy. So it's not that Chabad wrote the Tanya, it's that because of Tanya, we now have Chabad. Chabad is a Kabbalistic acronym, but what it really implies is the ability to think through something. And in every single aspect of Tanya, and in a sense every aspect of our lives, we're required to take ideas which are somewhat seminal, somewhat basic, or somewhat fundamental, and extract from them not only the beef and understanding and the general support for that idea, but also to bring it down into our very lives. And if a person could do that in everything in their life, right away everything will find its place. You're not going to have anything in your life which is random. Because if it's emotional, where does it come from? If it's purely intellectual, then how has it been drawn down into a practical state? So essentially what the mind is able to do is able to filter through everything in life and able to deduce it down or reduce it down to its practical application. Another word for Das is the application. So imagine somebody, just one more example to fill it in. Imagine someone wants to build a house. So you have in your mind, you have your dream house, you have your idea, right? You're going to have how many floors and how many rooms and what colors and so on, but it's not on paper, it's in your mind, right? And naturally, just same way like a dream, a lot of things in your mind don't have to make sense, right? So you can have a floor plan, beautiful floor plan of floor 1, floor 2, floor 3, and then an architect will look at you and say, where's the stairs? And then you realize that you have no way to get from floor 1 to floor 2, so you build stairs. And over the course of the Binah process, you're building your house. You actually sketch it out. And you say, okay, well, this will be this big and this will be that big. And then you start getting even more complex with feet and inches and meters and open space and closed space and doors, where the doors swing which way, this way and that way. Finally, at the end of the whole process, you have a layout, a blueprint, which is the Das. So what's meant to happen is you're supposed to go from the creative idea, the initial idea, through the comprehension of it, and the comprehension is probably the most tedious process, and then Das is the realization of it. When you work on coming to a final conclusion, a final model. Actually, one way of translating Chochma, Binah and Daas is concept, comprehension, and conclusion. Right? Some call it analysis, antithesis, and synthesis. It's all this process of going from point A to point B to point C. Point A being the initial, the creative process. On the opposite side is the analysis, coming to general theories. Will that work? Hypothesis. No, that won't work. Fine. And then coming to a final conclusion based on all your understanding. That is how the mind works. You have three brains, and the three brains generate all your ideas, filter your ideas, and so on. Section 2, which is on page 58, begins with this concept, but then explains where the feelings come from. So you have your mind, you have your understanding, but then where do you get feelings from? So the author explains, feelings come when a person understands something. So if a person only has, let's say, the Chochma part, only has the creative part, person just is inspired, pure inspiration, or if a person only has the comprehension part, usually they go together. More or less, they go together. If a feeling comes only from those two, not necessarily will there be a lasting feeling. Or there could be what's called for instance, it's an idea, right? An idea. You hear an idea, you get excited. Where's the idea go after a while? It's just nowhere. It's your list of quotes. You have a quote book. You write your quote, and it stays. Sometimes you'll read something. You'll spend your entire day thinking about it to the point where years later you can quote that quote. And not only quote it, but also explain it and also understand and apply it in your life, understand how it applies in your life. Here's the quote, here's what it means, and here's how it changed my life in a certain way. When we have this, we end up with 2 sets of emotions. So there are 7 emotions. We explained there are 10 levels altogether, 3 intellectual, 7 emotional. In the 7 emotional, you have 2 sides, if you will. Okay? If you're familiar with the Kabbalah, man, you have the right side, left side. Right side is creativity, left side is comprehension. The middle, the combination, the intersection between those 2 is understanding, is dot. Then again, in the emotional side, you have the right side, left side, and center. Right side, left side, and center. You have 6 emotions, and then you have the entire picture, which is called the last emotion, which is called Malchut, which is not really an emotion per se. It's really the reception of all the faculties. But what this means is you end up with love on the right, and you end up with fear on the left. What is love and fear? Love essentially means anything that you desire or long for. So if you want something, that's called love. You could like it, you could love it a lot. It's all different forms of you wanting something. Fear could be fear, any sort of fear. Let's say you worried about losing something, or losing someone, or you're worried about disappointing someone. Those are all levels of fear. Anxiety, what's anxiety? Anxiety is usually a feeling that comes from worrying about something that will happen, usually negative. Anticipation usually is something that you're waiting for something positive. So the anxiety is you're worried about something negative. The anticipation is you're looking forward to something positive, right? Of course, you could also have anxiety and anticipation from both sides, but the point is that you really have these 2 major emotions of either wanting to get closer to something or wanting to get further away from something else. There's an interesting idea here that where do you see and where do you experience longing, usually, when you're far away from something. So, because longing wants to become closer, because love wants to achieve, it wants to get closer, you're looking to get somewhere, where do you feel that most? When you're very far away. Contrary to that is fear or resistance to something. Where do you feel resistance? When you're close. You want to get further away. You're so afraid of something, you want to back off. So it's actually interesting that I once heard that in relationships, when do we become disgusted by people? When we're too close to them, right? When do we miss someone? When we're very far from them. So if you want to know if someone's important in your life, spend time away from them, and then if you really want to them when you're away from them, that's a good sign. If you don't know if they're good for you or not, you don't know if you like them, or you don't know if there's anything about them that bothers you, spend more time with them. You'll figure out very quickly which friends you could hang out with and which friends you can't. But both of these only occur after you actually know what it is you're yearning for, or know what it is you're trying to get away from. There's also, it's interesting that in this longing state, this is on page 61, you have static love and you have dynamic love. Static love, according to the Tanya, is like the love of water, which is similar to the inspiration you get from a quote, or similar to inspiration you get from this, 1 second hit, if you will, of a 1 second dose, a single dose of inspiration. What is that? You understand it. It's very ethereal. It's very logical, but it doesn't really change you. It doesn't really affect you on an emotional level. That's called the love. That's called the love of water. It's a good quote. I like it. It means something. It's important to me. Here, check, save, bookmark, whatever. The second love, which is called the dynamic love, is a much deeper and much more fiery love. It's called love of fire. Fire is a dynamic love which doesn't stay still for a second, and it's always changing. It's going up, it's going down. It's dying, it's growing. It's equated that the static love can be compared to love between a brother and a sister, or even between a child and a parent. The love is not based on an emotion; it's based on the facts. The fact is, they're my parent. I love them. They gave me what I want in life. They gave me what I need. They raised me for all these years. I love them for who they are. The second emotion is similar to a husband and a wife, where the love was not always there. There was a point where, let's say, there was no love, and then all of a sudden the love sort of comes, and then the love dies down, and then you put more fuel in the fire, and the love springs up again. So the love is dynamic. So in our relationships with people, our relationships with God primarily, which is what Tanya deals with, it can be extrapolated to any field, is that when we have a love for something which is based on an idea alone, it's going to be a static love. I like this, I don't like this. It tastes good, it doesn't taste good. It's very simple. Either it's because it's emotional, or it's because it's intellectual. But when it's both, when it has this dynamic of intellect and emotion, then the love could be a fiery love, and I can keep on throwing fuel in the fire. I could constantly fan these fuel this love, essentially. And how is that done? This is done through understanding. So when a person, by understanding, by appreciating, by delving into something, we begin to have a deeper and deeper love for it. If we understand why something exists, ask why, right? What's the next thing? The something of why, the power of why, the power of why, I think, right? The why is so critical today because everybody's worried about how. Everyone worries about the worry is about if, the worry is about when, right? Which are all static things. When, who, how. If you think about why should a person marry this person, right? Why should you start this business? Why should you engage? Why should you read this book? The why is so much more important because if you know why a book is important, let's say, even if you get to chapter 4 and it's boring, you'll still go to chapter 5 because it's important that you read the book and important why you read the book. If it's just, it felt good for the first few chapters and now it doesn't, then you drop it. So knowing why is so critical, and why, of course, starts in Da'at. It comes from the intellectual faculties. So through meditation, through concentration, through fixation, a person is able to bring the why into their life in such a way that it changes the very emotional nature towards that thing, and then you could have love, which means you want more of it, or fear, in quotes, which means you want less of it. And this allows the thought, or this allows the idea, or the thing in general to become sustainable, and that the emotions should constantly be able to have energy. So, in the words of the Chochma Levavot, you have the soul of being pure. If the soul is pure and spiritual, what does the soul want? Purely spiritual things. And anything that's not purely spiritual is despised, is not interested in. So the soul, why does the soul want to do selfless things? Why does the soul want to engage in acts of goodness and kindness constantly? Because its very nature is to do things which are soulful. What does sleep and eating and having fun do for the soul? Nothing. The only reason why it's important, what the soul does have to understand, and it learns this very quickly, is that if the body is not healthy, the soul is not going to be able to survive. So the soul's ability to do kindness, per se, is only through a body which is healthy physically. So the soul understands the value of physical needs, material needs. Conversely, you have the godly soul and the animal soul, right? What does the animal soul learn from the godly soul? That life is not all eating and sleeping and playing games, right? Life could also be deeper. Life is deeper, and the proof of that is that it doesn't feel fulfilled if it only eats and sleeps and drinks and be merry for tomorrow we may die. It has to feel a sense of neediness. Has to feel a sense of it has a sense of neediness, but to be needed for something greater, to become part of something greater, right? Who wants to be great? I think that was your quote for today, right? Who wants to be great? Yeah, to be great, you could be great, or you could be part of something greater than yourself. And any person could be great. And everyone wants to be great. And people, every creature wants to be great. Great means the greatest you can be. And if it is the greatest it can be, it's happy. If you give a plant sunlight and oxygen and soil and water, it's happy as can be. It's not going to complain. The only creature which could complain or does complain when it does not have all of its needs, even if it has all of its needs, is the human being. Because the human being realizes, because the human being is intellectual, is able to understand on the deeper level deeper than an animal could ever understand, is that life is not just about being content. Life is about achieving something greater than we can be. As a matter of fact, every single level of creation, we'll finish off with this because it's an interesting idea, that every single level of creation really wants this as well. Right? But it's so easy to do. Or it's a passive thing that either will happen or won't happen. For example, water wants to become greater than water. What's water? Water is static. Water, like a rock, it doesn't move, it's either pushed or it's stationary. It can stay in the same place for 1,000 years if you don't move it, right? A rock, the same thing. What makes it move? Other things. So, for instance, if water wants to become greater than water, what does it have to do? It must be submerged or infused into a plant. So when a plant sucks up the water, when a tree uses the water for growth, the water is now going into a higher existence, which is from water, stationary, to a plant which has life of some sort. The plant grows. So now the water is now moving up into a higher chain of life force. The plant, also being limited by, like we said, the four things, right? Sunlight and so on. It's still limited by its own ability. It cannot move. A plant can't transport from one place to another by its own will. What could happen? It can be eaten by an animal, consumed by an animal. Now it's part of a living organism which actually could walk and move and transport itself, right? It becomes a higher existence. The animal, similarly, is limited by its own animalistic desires. Animals never built a city. Animals can't, see or understand outside of themselves. Someone said the difference between a human being and an animal is an animal is aware of itself. Very aware of itself. But itself, that's it. That's its limitation. A human being is able to be aware that he's aware, or that she's aware. The awareness is metacognition. So the animal wants that too. It has to be consumed by a human being. We're not getting into the whole whether or not it should be consumed, how it should be consumed. We're talking about that it should be consumed. And when it's consumed, it becomes a human being. The human being, what's so unique about the human being is that it has the ability to do for others. But even then, the human being feels limited and always wants to transcend to become spiritual. And that's why the human being always aspires to become angelic in some way, either by its actions, hopefully by actions, and even by its nature. So it's much easier to be righteous by action. It's harder to be righteous by nature. And this is really goes back to this tzaddik Binah dynamic. Is that the Binah is trying to do perfect things. It may not be perfect. I'm not perfect, but I do perfect things. I do holy things. I do good things. The tzaddik is able to actually be perfect, which is a much higher level, which most of us only aspire to, which is why we're supposed to want to be perfect, but at the very least, we're supposed to want to do perfect. And thereby, we become angelic to some extent. We may not be angels, may not be perfect, but we're able to at least tap into the angelic part of ourselves, our godly soul, which allows us to transcend ourselves, be greater than ourselves. Because if we're only doing great, we're great by ourselves. But if we become greater than ourselves, absorbing ourselves into a greater mission, a greater goal, a greater world, then it takes on a whole. We become superhuman, not because we're able to fly and do tricks, but because we're able to do things that one person alone, a human being cannot do. And with that, we conclude the chapter. That's the 10. That's the 10 dynamics of the soul, and everything we're going to explain next week. That this all is what the soul is, and then there's also what the soul does. So the lower 3 levels of the soul is thought, speech, and action. So intellect does not mean your thinking, and speech is not necessarily your emotions. Intellect is simply your ability to your potential of thought, right? Where the thoughts come from. Emotion, or where the emotions come from. But then there's the activity of thought, speech, and action. So when you actually think, when you meditate, let's say, you're using your thought. When you're expressing yourself, you're using your emotion. When you do something, you're using your action, your physical action. And those are called the garments of the soul, which we'll talk about next week. Good?